Welcome to our Circular Industries talk, hosted by Leiden-Delft-Erasmus Center for Sustainability. My name is Ilse Markenstein. I'm the Center Manager of the LE Center for Sustainability, and I will be the moderator of today's talk. Our center focuses on the transition towards a circular economy, circular society related to industries, cities, and the agri-food sector. And in our circular industries talks, we share knowledge on topics such as research use, circular product design, transition management, and governance circularity. And our speaker of today is a PhD researcher at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering at the TU Delft. And in his research, he tries to better understand the role of humans, technologies, and knowledge in transforming social practices related to the energy transition. I would like to give the floor to Evert van Beek.
Thanks a lot. Yes. Thanks for the opportunity of allowing me to present here. I will share my screen. Yes. So today I want to talk a little bit about, this is actually based on a study that I did almost 2 years ago, I would say. And the topic of it is towards a closed loop of innovation, and like the subtitle is Innovations in Waiting in Sustainably Heated Households. My main claim for this presentation is that innovation follows material disruption in the household, and then there are some opportunities here. And what I will talk about is something that I'm writing down in a paper as well, which is currently somewhere in the long academic review process. I will basically summarize the paper and provide a little bit more of a background to what we will be doing in the paper. So maybe a bit about the context and maybe also about myself. I work at TU Delft, and my research is situated in a much larger research program called Integrale Energietransitie-bestaande Bouw, which stands for like an integrated energy transition of the existing built environment. It's very much focused on the Netherlands and very much focused on how to transition away from fossil fuels for heating in homes and also in other buildings, but I will be mostly focusing on homes. And so that is a bit of the background. Dutch energy transition is very much part of that, of course. And I am in the Faculty of Industrial Design, and I am a designer by training myself, and that you might be able to notice that in what I will talk about in this presentation. So I speak as a designer, and the way that I look at my findings and my data is also as a designer. So to talk a little bit about the Dutch energy transition and how that relates to households, I've made a bit of an overview of what that means. So really the purpose of the Dutch energy transition is to decrease the energy demand of residential buildings, ideally working with existing residential buildings. So there is of course a lot of newly built houses, but mostly I'll be focusing on the existing residential buildings because there is a huge challenge here to decrease the energy demand of those buildings. And in those existing buildings, we have a long history of gas condensing boiler heating. So that is the typical boiler system that you find in most Dutch homes at the moment. As part of the energy transition, the challenge is to transfer to change this situation of gas condensing boiler heating systems to heat pumps, and specifically the most ideal situation, which works best with the existing infrastructure, is air-to-water heat pumps or ground-to-water or water-to-water heat pumps. The specific technological execution is not super important for now, at least, because what I'm mostly interested in is how this has an effect on the households, the residents living there, and what they do in their everyday life. So heat pumps which supply their heat through water systems, so that basically means that there is a hot water is flowing through existing radiators or underground heating. With heat pumps, that's the temperature of that water is much lower than that the gas condensing boilers could provide. So there's low temperature heating rather than the high temperature heating that we used to have before. Having this low temperature heating requires buildings to be better insulated in order to still be able to be heated to a comfortable temperature. Better insulation then requires mechanical ventilation, because that is when you have buildings that are much more airtight, so better insulated. Ventilation doesn't happen like naturally through openings in the buildings, so mechanical ventilation is required. Another consequence of heat pumps compared to the existing gas condensing boiler heating systems is that there is a limited supply of domestic hot water. So, showers, there is only a limited amount of hot water available per day for those showers, because the heat pumps can heat much slower than the existing boiler systems. So this is all just a bit of background that will help to understand my findings a little bit. So it's a bit technical, and you don't have to remember all of this, but this is a bit of a background. And but before I want to go into the content of my research, I also need to talk a little bit about the background in theoretical terms. So my research has a specific theoretical starting point, and that is theories of practice. And theories of practice is a type of social theories, sociological theory as well. And within this theoretical framework, the question is basically, what is it that people do in everyday life? What does everyday life look like when we look at what people do? And how is that action organized? How do people happen to do the same thing as what other people do? So those are the practices. And the way that practices are defined is in this theoretical framework: patterns of organized actions executed by multiple individuals, so not just by one person doing something once at a time, but in some sort of rhythm, doing it multiple times, multiple individuals, and it includes the material world as well. So it's practices, what people do, are intimately tied up with objects. And those objects can be technologies. Now, this is all fairly abstract, of course, but I think the best example to explain theories of practice and practices as a phenomenon is the example of cooking. So when I cook, when I come home tonight and I cook, it's not just something that I happen to do by myself as an individual, but I participate in something that is done widely in society. I learned this from other people. Many other people are doing cooking in very similar ways, of course, using the same devices, using sometimes the same recipes. And so then there is also these skills embedded, for example, in recipes and instructions that are carried over and shared by other people as well. There is, of course, a sort of certain rhythm and regularity to cooking, so people do it every day. It's done very differently in very different cultures. So the time invested, the utensils used, of course, are very different. And again, this is also intimately tied up with objects. So, for example, using a rice cooker is very different from using a pan, and that changes the whole thing of what people are doing and how they do the cooking. So, theories of practice. How is this relevant to sustainability? So, when you look at practices such as cooking, it doesn't really make sense to just talk about sustainable technology. So, is one cooking stove more sustainable than the other? It also doesn't really make sense to talk only about sustainable human behavior. So, how quickly you turn off the stove. Instead, we need to look at practices as integrated units and talk about sustainable practices. So which practices are sustainable? Using a stove in a very specific way, in a way that is sustainable, is sort of a function of both what people are doing and the objects involved in that, the technologies involved in that. And these theories of practice also allows us to look beyond the individual that is carrying out a practice, but also at a practice as a social unit. So cooking is performed by many people. So if there is a change to that practice of cooking, it impacts a lot of people instead of just the individual. But then the question, of course, is how do those practices relate and how do they change? And to start with that last question, when does change happen? So within theories of practice, change is understood to happen as something that happens throughout the practice. So every time I do cooking slightly different, there is a change in the practice. So, for example, it might be that, I don't know, we move in together and that changes slightly how I do my cooking, because then I guess I have to cook for different people. Or we get rid of a certain pan because it breaks down. That also changes the practice of cooking slightly because I have to use another type of pan or buy a new one. Or I learn something new, such as, personally, I don't know how to use a rice cooker, but maybe if I've learned the skill of cooking rice with a rice cooker, there is a change in that practice. So these are the things that I talked about, like an element can be lost, a pan can be lost, but new elements can also be newly introduced. And so what I'm interested in this case is in the introduction of new elements. So as I said in the beginning, as part of the energy transition, heat pumps are introduced because heat pumps are in general considered a good idea because they are very efficient ways of heating homes. But then the question is, of course, how does the introduction of a heat pump in homes, in the practices of heating, how does that change a practice as people perform it in their households? So to bring this all together, the introduction of a heat pump in people's homes can be considered a disruption to the practices as they are performed. So instead of gas-based boiler systems, we now have heat pumps. Something needs to change in the practices of heating their homes because that is it's slower heating. There are all kinds of different ways in which this heat pump has an impact on homes. And so that changes the performance of how people perform their practice. And what I'm then also interested in is how that might have an impact beyond that that change just within that household. And I will give quite a few examples after this. But the way that this impact beyond the specific practice is conceptualized is as within certain parts of theories of practices as innovations in waiting. So the reason for that is that we see a certain change within certain households, but then they also have an impact. They could have an impact beyond. So they are innovations, but they are innovations in waiting because they have not had the impact beyond the household that they were done in. So I'll now quickly go to more specifically what I've done, but this is just a bit of a background, of course. When I started the study, I had these questions. So how is everyday life in the household reconfigured when a heat pump is introduced? How can we consider those reconfigurations innovations in waiting? So which ones are, I guess, interesting is the question here. And then also, how are they related beyond the specific situation and impacting other practices? So the way that I went about this is I did videography, like I said, more than 2 years, no, more than a year ago. It's not even that long ago. In March and April of 22, videography basically means that I went into people's homes with a video camera and I asked them to enact and perform the practices that they normally do. So I asked them about, like, how do you heat your homes? Can you show me how you do these kind of things? I did that in 11 households in the Netherlands that all have had recently a heat pump introduced. Now, something that that is also relevant here is I showed you this graph, but there's a few more consequences here, which will help provide some background to my findings. When there is low temperature heating, the heating also goes pretty slow. So instead of like fast heating, you can turn up the thermostat and then you have 22 degrees in a few hours. It can take a day or more to heat a home with a few degrees. But also these heat pumps and the mechanical ventilation can be quite noisy. So that is a consequence that people also have to deal with. In order to provide better insulation, people are asked to keep their windows closed. So yeah, just to provide better insulation, which is also something that a lot of people in the Netherlands, a lot of residents aren't really used to. And something else is that a mechanical ventilation system typically has air filters that need to be replaced from time to time. This is just background to explain why I see certain findings. So now I can go on to what I've found in this research. And I have grouped them into different reconfigurations. So reconfigurations are kind of the innovations that happen in homes. So changes that are done in homes that we observed. So one example is that certain people, due to the very slow heating, stopped looking at the thermostat. The thermostat was actually quite complicated, and because of the thermostat, they didn't look at the thermostat anymore for like half a year. They didn't know how to use it anymore. It was kind of a complicated system, but because of the slow heating and a lack of interaction with the thermostat, they didn't know how to use it anymore. So that is an example of understandings which they previously used to have because they knew how to use it. But now they didn't know anymore. This is understandings made obsolete. There were also newly developed understandings. So, for example, some of my participants developed the skills and the understanding to prepare their house for guests that would arrive later and to turn up the heating like a day before, for example. So that is a skill and an understanding that they developed because of the heat pump that was introduced in their home. Then we also observed cases of experimentation, where people basically started experimenting with opening and closing the windows in order to better understand how the heat pump heated their home. So they tracked the temperature settings, for example, and the temperature that they measured in their homes, and like checked, what if we open the windows, what does that change about the way that the heat pump is doing something. So these are examples of changing understandings that people have. Then we also observed material reconfigurations. So what you see in the picture is a person who would try to resolve the issue of noise. So in the cupboard that you see there's the heat pump located, and this person installed a lot of extra insulation, sound insulation, in order to resolve the inconvenience of the noise of the heat pump. Another example is a person who installed a backup heater to improve the performance of the heat pump. The heat pump was not actually strong enough or powerful enough to provide them with the heat, the temperature that they wished. So they installed a backup heater. And finally, an example of a material reconfiguration. So this is a configuration to the material setting. Is a family that takes advantage of the extra radiators that were installed in their renovated homes in order to dry their clothes. So instead of like having to use the washer dryer machine, they used a radiator to dry their clothes. Then we have an example of reconfigurations of routines. So this category of reconfigurations is about how people, and together with, in this case, cats, change their daily routines. So this family has a new routine of keeping the door just a little bit open for the cats, so that the cats can get onto the balcony without losing too much heat. So they open this balcony door just a little bit on only the right, when the weather was right. They opened the door just a little bit to allow the cats to go through without losing all the heat that the heat pump provided. So but we call these things innovations in waiting, with the idea that these kind of changes, these kind of reconfigurations to daily routines, to material settings, that these also have an impact beyond just this specific household. And we also found a few examples of this impact, where we could like really pinpoint that these reconfigurations also have an impact beyond the specific household. So this is an example where someone who changed the settings of his systems to provide more hot water. They really like dove into the settings of the system. They changed it at their own home, but also at the neighbor's place. So that is where they developed an understanding and an idea of how the system worked, and then also applied it beyond their own household. Another example is people who look at neighbors opening and closing the windows to see what is normal. So they explained that we open the windows and we close the windows, not just because we think it's comfortable and we think this is considered acceptable in these homes, but also because we think that it is normal because other people are doing it. And we also found quite a few examples where this impact did not just spread to other households, but also to professional practices. So to the professional stakeholders and actors that are involved in these kind of processes of renovating homes and installing heat pumps. So, for example, there was a family that was really working together with the professionals, with the housing association and the technicians that work there to improve the performance. They were checking the temperature, communicating this to the professionals involved, and in that way, the findings that they had in their own homes, the experiments that they did, they also have an impact on professional practices. And then what you see in the picture is this family that talked a lot about how there was a lot of dust on the air filters, and they did a few experiments in order to find out where the dust came from, and it turned out that that was related to construction that was going on in the neighborhood. So these are there was talk, there was communication, there was changes in the household, and then that had an effect on professional practices as well. So to wrap up a little bit, I found that there were reconfigurations of understandings, there were material reconfigurations, and there were reconfigurations of routines. These are just some categories of reconfigurations that happened when a heat pump was introduced. And they sometimes had an impact beyond the household, sometimes on other households in the neighborhood, for example, or people that knew each other. And sometimes they had an impact on professional practices as well. So what have we learned from that about innovations in waiting? First of all, we looked not just at households as a closed box, but looked at it, we kind of opened the box of the household. And that is a different approach than typical within this field, where it's just the current approach is basically to replace a boiler system and really forget about the rest that is happening in the household. And when we open that box, we see that households are not just receivers of technology, but they are creative actors in the way that they use and appropriate these technologies. They locally adapt and kind of optimize the use of these technologies, and we conceptualized these disruptions that happen as something that is not necessarily to be avoided. We don't necessarily need to continue household practices as they were always happening, but they might actually be beneficial and types of innovation. So how is this then related to I introduced it as a closed loop. So when residents live together with their technologies in their homes, and design practices introduce new technologies. And that leads to new and innovative practices. So people start doing things differently. So that's the reconfigurations that I talked about. Then my proposal, and this coming from a designer, I guess, is can we close that loop a little bit more? Can we close the loop between new and innovative practices, the things that people are doing in their homes? Can we connect that to the things that designers are doing? And these are just really a few smaller ideas that or not necessarily small ideas, but initial ideas that I have for closing this loop. Instead of defining how exactly people should use these heat pumps, I would argue that technologies need to be responsive to different practices. As designers, we need to relocate creativity and authorship of the way that people use it from the design process. So as designers, we should like not consider ourselves so much as like the inventors of new technology, and then people just have to start using them. What we need to look at end users as creative actors. And this is a form of participatory design, which can be stimulated in demonstration homes and living labs settings. So yeah, I hope this this presentation kind of convinced you of my main claim that innovation follows material disruption in the household. So material disruption in this case was the introduction of a heat pump, and that there are some opportunities here. And that was it.
Thank you very much, Evert, for this interesting presentation. And it is very related to my personal situation at the moment. Last week, I received the key of my new apartment, also with a heat pump and with mechanical ventilation, a lot of insulation. We got a lot of information from the builder. So I was also curious, how do you think, because the builder is the person we talk to, as I'm gonna start living in a new apartment. How can they also help share the knowledge you've gained as designers, because that's a step, you're a step back in the chain, as I can see.
Yeah. Yeah, a great question. And I speak as a designer, of course, and then at one hand, it's a matter of like using these existing insights, but also I kind of want to emphasize that this is sort of a two-way street. I don't know what to call that, but like they do not only have to like share the findings, my findings to you. So there's maybe some interesting things you can like learn about slower heating and keeping windows closed and those kind of things, where they instruct you. But my argument is also that these people need to like listen to you in a way. So they ideally they pay attention to the way that you start using this heat pump and the way that you adopt it in your practices and how that changes your life in a way. So they can learn from that. And I guess one of a lot of the outcomes of these are in a way basic findings. So when people lose an understanding of how their thermostat works, then well, maybe the thermostat should be easier. Like there should be not have all these usability issues that they have now. Yeah, and what should they communicate to you? I'm not entirely sure. My main focus is on what I can learn from you.
Yeah, and think the other way around. Because last week we were told this is what you should do. That is how they communicate at the moment.
Yeah.
I was wondering, are there questions from the audience? You can raise your hand, or you can share your question in the chat. And in the meantime, I have another question about the consortium that you are doing your PhD for. So the integrale energietransitie bestaande bouw. Can you tell a bit more about this consortium and what they are also going to do with your findings, for instance?
Yeah. Most of the integrale energietransitie bestaande bouw is a consortium of multiple universities, so TU Delft, but also some universities of applied sciences, and TNO, and then there are also quite a few industry partners involved. So these are, for example, organizations that work with heat pumps. They sell heat pumps, for example, to installation companies, and then there are also some organizations that do larger projects where whole buildings are renovated. And I'm particularly interested in social housing for several reasons, because there's I would say the most impact to be made at once, because these are typically large organizations that do renovations on a larger scale. And the way that the industry partners are using our insights is I'm organizing a few workshops in the near future with them to develop this kind of this line of thinking a little bit more, also in collaboration with them, because of course the initial ideas that I presented, such as living labs, are new to installation companies, which tend to be very engineering focused, use a very linear process where they buy a heat pump, install it, and then leave it to residents to adopt it in their everyday practices. But they also notice that things are, as part of the energy transition, things are changing pretty fast, which is very new to an industry that is also in a way quite conservative. So there is certainly some interest in kind of closing the loop and getting some insights from end use and applying it in, well, the way that they communicate, but also the way that they set up their systems, because they now, for example, there are a lot of assumptions about how people live. So, for example, about how much domestic hot water people need. So, currently, people use the installers just use a rule of thumb where 120 liters for an average household should be plenty, so that people don't go over that limit. But in practice, what I also found is that that happens quite a lot, that people use more than 120 liters of hot water in a day, especially with larger families. So yeah, there is a certain interest in like this kind of adaptability to the situation, to the diversity of residents that we have. But then, of course, the challenge is how do we make sure that the outcome is still sustainable, like that we reduce the energy consumption, because we can build a lot more flexible systems, but then those systems become also more consume more energy, because they are typically bigger. The bigger the energy system, the more energy it consumes, but also the more flexible it is to different people.
Yeah, because I was also thinking what should be the main focus, the sustainability of the design, or that people have their autonomy and can adjust it and do what they how they would like to live. So that I think that's also a bit of tension maybe over there. Yeah.
And there's that also has to do with the kind of assumptions that are being made in the design process. So typically, one of the assumptions is that what people are really interested in is saving on the energy bill, and that is, of course, that is a huge motivation. But also, residents are not like rational economic actors in that they are not just optimizing for saving on the energy bill. They also want to continue living their life as they intended to. But what I then also found, and that is kind of where the innovation part comes in, is that residents sometimes have very good ideas on how to save energy within their specific situation, which the system doesn't really adapt to. So, for example, the cat is one example where this is very much against the advice that installers would give. They would argue that keep the windows closed because that is where you're losing a lot of energy. But then residents finding and kind of inventing this routine of just temporarily opening the window just enough to allow the cat to walk through. And then we also found in other cases where I don't have pictures of that, unfortunately, but where people kind of covered up most of the window opening, but just with the smallest gap for the cats to go through. So yeah, so what I saw there is that residents have inventive and creative ideas that that installation professionals and designers of these systems can work with, can use, and think about how to make sure that the renovations allow for these kind of creative ideas.
Yeah, and those insights are also very useful. Yeah.
I would have a question if you have time.
Yeah, Silke, yeah.
Yeah, because you're saying that every solution is kind of adapted to what fits in the specific context of the resident. So how would you say that this could be aggregated or something like, because it is very specific indeed how it is applied. So how would you say these lessons can be taken, because then you could indeed look at every specific thing. But I think, I don't know if you would agree, but this is almost impossible to do, perhaps, or is there some way of aggregating these lessons?
Yeah. Yeah, great question as well. So what I noticed is, and this is not really a sort of end solution, but what I noticed is that a lot of, so part of my ethnographic research I did in people who bought their homes and sometimes did the renovations themselves, and part of it I did in social housing complexes where like many people live together in a similar building, and there we also see the influence of the way that the building is set up, and people adapt it to their own local situation, but that local situation is kind of similar to their neighbors. So I really think that on a neighbor level, there is a certain aggregation to be made, but that requires a large role for example, social housing organizations, and again, certain like tight loops between residents and professionals who are making these changes or instructing people about other things. So it really becomes this kind of social process where all the where neighborhoods are relevant, people that know each other and communicate to each other have a very large role to play. And then also, for example, these kind of demonstration homes are typically these homes that are often renovated before the whole building is renovated. So we just apply the renovation to one of the homes, and then we show, just to experiment a little bit with how this will work out, but also to show it to the rest of the neighborhood. So yeah, so that is maybe one of them. Another one that I'm thinking about is, or one which I do not really want to focus on, but in the installation world, basically in the world of installation professionals, there is this upcoming phenomenon of learning communities where they like really come together. The professionals come together to share their insights that they that they gathered in practice, and then they like come together in the evening, for example, talk about what they did in certain places, and they communicate to each other what were like the best practices, why things did or did not work in certain homes. So I hope that could be another avenue as well.
So also more interdisciplinary sharing of knowledge and experiences as well.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the public? Then I would like to thank you, Evert, for your talk, and I'm also looking forward to my own experiences with the heat pump and how it will work out in practice. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank
and
you.
I hope to, Silke, when is the next Circular Industries talk?
We have a summer break now, so
Okay.
I think the 10th of September or something, the second week of September.
Okay. We hope to see you back then, everybody, in September. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Nice.